This is not a headline moment, it is a pressure point, and once crossed it does not bend back. What almost no one is paying attention to right now is that Donald Trump may have stepped into a legal terrain that does not allow retreat. What appears on the surface to be a foreign policy maneuver tied to Venezuela is in reality something far more dangerous for him because it pulls him away from the arena of politics and places him inside the machinery of law. And once that machinery begins to move, it does not care who triggered it or how powerful they believe themselves to be. This moment mattered because when a leader reaches across borders and asserts control over another nation's resources, the act does not stay symbolic. It immediately activates layers of sovereignty treaties, contracts, and legal doctrines that exist precisely to stop unilateral power from expanding unchecked, and that is why this situation has not escalated with military threats or dramatic speeches, but with filings, objections, statements of jurisdiction, and formal language that quietly redefines the battlefield. Russia, China, and multiple international actors did not respond by saying Trump was mistaken or misguided. They responded by saying the move was unlawful, and that word changes everything because unlawful removes the issue from debate and places it into review. Once something is framed as unlawful, it no longer depends on opinion polling or media cycles. It becomes a matter for judges, regulators, and institutions whose authority does not rise or fall with popularity. Judicial systems do not negotiate with narratives, they evaluate authority and limits, and by invoking emergency justifications to assert control over Venezuelan oil, Trump entered a legal zone that emergency powers were never meant cover because under U.S. law, emergencies exist to neutralize threats, not to restructure foreign economies, and courts have repeatedly drawn that line. Stretching emergency authority beyond its defined purpose transforms power into overreach and overreach into violation. That distinction is crucial because policy failure can be debated, but legal violation must be addressed, and that is why this moment is different from every controversy that came before it. This is not about whether Trump was right or wrong. It is about whether he was permitted or prohibited, and when the question becomes permitted or prohibited, the answer no longer comes from voters, it comes from judges, and judges do not compromise. They issue rulings. Once a ruling is issued, it does not bind only one individual, it sets a standard that applies to every future leader, and institutions understand this clearly, which is why they are paying attention now. They are not reacting emotionally, they are responding structurally, because if a boundary is not defended at the moment it is crossed, it disappears entirely, and vanished boundaries do not return on their own. Legal systems move carefully but relentlessly because their objective is not punishment, but preservation. Preserving the system requires pulling the actor into the system and subjecting them to its processes. And that is exactly what has begun to happen, because every sanction, contract, shipment, and financial transaction connected to Venezuelan oil is now exposed to legal scrutiny. Exposure leads to review. Review establishes jurisdiction, and jurisdiction produces rulings. This is the chain reaction Trump has triggered, and it does not explode outward with spectacle, it collapses inward, converting authority into paperwork, discretion into evidence. Power into records and paper is where power stops performing and starts being measured. Performance has always been Trump's strength: volume, speed, dominance, and overwhelm, but none of that functions inside a courtroom where time stretches, noise fades, and decisions once issued cannot be undone. Court are dangerous opponents precisely because they cannot be distracted, attacked, or exhausted. They wait, and then they rule, and what makes this situation especially risky is that it does not belong to a single legal system. It touches international law, domestic law, trade sanctions, constitutional limit, and regulatory authority all at once. Each domain has its own institutions, its own timelines, and its own enforcement mechanisms, and no individual can control them all simultaneously. That is why legal scholars describe this as a convergence point, a moment when multiple legal domains align on one actor at the same time, and when that happens, pressure compounds faster than any defense can respond. The move may look decisive on television, but in law it appears fragile because power without authority is not power. It is liability, and liability does not fade, it accumulates as liability accumulates. It attracts enforcement, and enforcement is what turns questions into consequences. This is the phase Trump may now be entering, where actions are no longer argued, but examined, no longer framed, but filed, no longer defended, but judged. And once that phase begins, volume becomes irrelevant because systems do not listen, they process, and processing is how institutions reclaim control. This is why the moment matters, because Trump has not merely angered governments, he has activated systems, and systems, once activated, are designed to run to completion. Restoring limits is not dramatic, it is procedural, and that quiet restoration is what ultimately restrains leaders who push too far. Whether Trump escalates or retreats, that force is now in motion. And forces like this do not reverse. What makes this moment irreversible is not diplomatic backlash, but formal questioning of authority. Once authority is questioned in a legal forum, it never fully returns to normal. It becomes conditional, and conditional authority must be justified repeatedly. Justification is exhausting because scrutiny accumulates, while defenses only delay. The systems now engaged do not sit in one courtroom or under one flag. They exist across international bodies, domestic courts, regulatory agencies, financial oversight frameworks, and congressional review structures. Each operates independently, which means there is no single lever to pull, no speech to give, no crowd to energize that can shut them all down. This network effect is what transforms controversy into containment, because every ruling empowers the next institution to act. Every review creates precedent for further inquiry. And this is how legal containment functions, not through confrontation, but through sequence. Political actors can fight opponents, but they cannot escape sequence, because sequence answers only to statutes, filings, and deadlines. That is why this phase is more threatening than elections, protests, or scandals. Those rely on public attention, which is unstable. Legal systems rely on procedure, which is steady, and stability is what gradually constrains even the most dominant figures. Trump's long-standing vulnerability has been his view of rules as obstacles rather than structures. That approach can succeed in politics, but it collapses in law, because law does not bargain, it classifies. Once behavior is classified as unlawful, everything connected it becomes vulnerable to reversal, sanction, or enforcement, and that classification process has already begun as lawyers, regulators, and judges increasingly treat the Venezuela move not as disagreement but as potential overreach, and classification is always the first step toward consequence. Consequences in law rarely arrive with drama, they arrive with injunctions that freeze actions, subpoenas that extract information, rulings that block transactions, and oversight mechanisms that restrict future authority. None of these dominate headlines, but together they redraw the boundaries of what is possible, and when possibility shrinks, power shrinks with it. This is why leaders fear institutions more than rivals. Institutions do not argue, they decide, and decisions once made become embedded in the system. Systems outlast individuals, and Trump has always positioned himself as larger than systems, but this moment places him inside them, and inside a system size is irrelevant, only compliance matters. Escalation may fail here because escalation pressures opponents but strengthens processes. The more boundaries are challenged, the more justification institutions gain to tighten control. Institutions legitimize themselves through necessity, and Trump is now supplying that necessity by openly testing limits, creating a feedback loop where resistance triggers regulation, and regulation invites further resistance until the actor adapts or is contained. History shows that in this cycle, system usually prevails not because it is aggressive, but because it is patient. Patience is decisive when timelines extend beyond any single career, and that is why this moment matters, not as a dramatic downfall, but as a structural shift in how power is answered. It signals a transition from tolerance of boundary testing to normalization of enforcement. Once enforcement becomes routine, it no longer feels extraordinary. It becomes standard, and standard enforcement is how limits regain permanence. Permanence restores structure. Structure reduces the space any one leader can dominate, and whether it is Visible or not, that process is underway now. This is not a collapse. It is a narrowing, not a defeat, but a constriction, not an overthrow, but a containment, and containment is the quiet force that reshapes power without spectacle once activated. It does not seek permission to continue, it only requires time, and time remains the one resource no leader ever controls.